My name is Charles Duhigg, and I want to tell you a story that starts about 4 years ago. I'm a reporter at the New York Times, as was mentioned, and one of the nice things about being a reporter at the New York Times is that you have this magical ability to call people up and ask them any embarrassing question that occurs to you, and they feel like they have to answer it. And so about 4 years ago, I was curious and trying to figure out why some people are more productive than others, why some companies get more done, why are some people better at being creative on demand or focusing. And so I started calling a bunch of researchers and asking them this question, and all of them felt like they had this obligation to answer. And I'll be honest, going into this, I had this kind of hypothesis. My hypothesis was, let me just, the clicker is not actually working. Apparently they're going to make this work. My hypothesis going into this was that the most creative people, or the most productive people, the people who are most creative, they exist in this world, which will hopefully eventually come up here. Different clicker? Thank you. There we go. They exist in this world where they're surrounded by endless amounts of information. And so in order to become more productive, what they do is they essentially build this wall around them that prevents them from being overwhelmed by Twitter and Facebook and all the things that today can make our lives crazy. And so I went and I found all these researchers, I found all these very productive people, I asked them this question, and what they said to a person was basically, that is the worst theory we have ever heard in our entire life. It is totally wrong. What they said was that the most productive people tend to be productive not because they protect themselves from all the information that's out there, but because they think differently from everyone else. And in particular, they think differently in two important ways. The first is that people who are particularly productive, they tend to recognize that our brains evolved for a different type of world. Our brains evolved for a world where multitasking was something that was good, right? If a millennia ago, if you were someone who could plant crops and look for predators at the same time, if you could multitask that way, you had this huge advantage over your neighbor who could only plant crops or only look for predators. But more importantly, people who are productive today not only recognize that we have this instinct for multitasking, which is now sometimes a weakness, but that they build routines, what psychologists call contemplative routines, into their life that allow them to think more deeply. And that if you can build these routines into your life, if you can find ways to think more deeply, then what you can actually do is you can expose yourself to all kinds of information and pick and choose better which bits of it you want to pay attention to. Now, when I mention this contemplative routines, having this habit of thinking more deeply, many of you might think of scenes like this, right? Meditation. How many of you meditate or exercise on a regular basis or take a nice long bath in the morning or walk to school or work? Everyone raised their hands at one point. These are great activities, but these are not contemplative routines. The types of routines that allow us to think more deeply about our choices, that allow us to think about focus and to become more creative, they tend to be routines that feel more like work. And in particular, there's a big question among researchers, what types of habits, what types of mental habits do the most creative people engage in that allow them to reframe options, to look at a block of marble and see a sculpture instead of just a piece of rock? And to answer that, I want to illustrate what contemplative routines look like by telling you the story of Qantas Flight 32. Qantas Flight 32 is a large Airbus A380 jet that took off on a beautiful morning in 2010 from the Singapore airport headed towards Sydney, Australia. Now this plane, an Airbus A380, it's one of the largest, most complicated, most sophisticated aircrafts that have ever been built. Many of you, if you've flown from one continent to another, have probably traveled on this plane before. It's one of those with like the double-decker, levels, and you can like lay the seats down and fall asleep if you have enough money. It's a nice plane. And about 20 minutes into the flight of Qantas Flight 32, the pilot sitting in the cockpit heard this sound like thousands of marbles being thrown against the hull, the fuselage of the plane. Now, unbeknownst to them, what had just happened is that a fire had broken out in one of the jet engines of this plane. And the fire had happened at exactly the wrong spot, because it had occurred exactly where one of the turbines in one of the jets connected to the shaft. And as that fire got hotter, what it caused that fan blade to do was to detach from the shaft. And as that fan blade detached from the shaft, it shot through the wing. And as it shot through the wing, it punched this enormous hole in the wing of the plane. When the phone that took this photo was eventually recovered, one of the first things they thought to themselves was, why on earth did a passenger decide to take a selfie as soon as there was a hole that appeared in their wing? But that hole that you see right there, that's big enough for two people's bodies to pass through. What's crazy, though, is that this isn't the scary thing that happened on Qantas Flight 32. An Airbus A380 is such a complicated plane that it can actually sustain a damage like this and continue flying for the next 7 hours without any problem. The scary thing that happened is that when that fan blade detached, it hit another fan blade. And it caused that fan blade to explode into thousands of pieces. And as those pieces moved through the wing, it was like shrapnel from a bomb moving through the plane. This shrapnel began cutting through hydraulics lines and electrical lines and fuel lines. When they eventually recovered parts of the plane, or the plane wing itself, they said that it looked like someone had taken a machine gun and sprayed the bottom of the wing with bullets. Now, what's interesting is that as this is occurring, the pilots in the cockpit realize within seconds that they are living through one of the worst mid-air mechanical disasters in modern aviation. And the pilots are overseen by this guy, a guy named Richard Duhigg, who had been trained by the Australian military in how to fly. Is anyone here an Air Force vet? If you are, or if you know anyone who is, you know that when you learn to fly in the Air Force, what they do is they teach you a method of thinking that's known as situational awareness. Or put differently, building mental models to keep track of what's going on. These mental models are at the core of how we train our attention. It's how our brain learns what to pay attention to. And another way of saying that is that our brains have this tendency to tell ourselves stories about ourselves, about what's going on. And that's how it decides which details are important and which things it can ignore. A lot of what we know about building mental models comes from situations of looking, for instance, at firefighters. The best firefighters, they walk into buildings, burning buildings, and as soon as they do, they start telling themselves a story about what they expect to see. They say something like, I expect to see flames in that corner, and there's a staircase over there, and staircases burn faster than anything else, so I'm going to see more flames out of the staircase. And that way, when they walk into the room and they look over, and there's not that many flames coming out of the staircase as they expected, some part of their brain says, reframe what's going on. Pay attention to that staircase. Something is wrong. Don't go walk over there. Or in studies of people working in office environments, what we found is that the most productive people, they tend to tell themselves a story about what their day is going to be like that's just half a degree more specific than their peers. Most of us, for instance, will think to ourselves, oh, I have a meeting coming up at 10 o'clock, and then I have to leave for lunch at 11. But the most productive people, they tend to do things like say, I have a meeting coming up at 10 o'clock, and it's going to start with Jim bringing up that dumb idea he always brings up. And then Susan's going to disagree with Jim because Susan hates Jim, and there's something going on there. I don't really know what. And then I'm going to jump in with my brilliant idea, and I'm going to win the meeting. That's how the most productive people think. They tend to prepare their attention by building a story in their head of what they expect to have occur. And Richard Duhigg, the pilot of Qantas Flight 32, he loved this. He loved building stories. In fact, in the shuttle that morning that had come from the hotel to the airport, he had gone through this routine that he always went through with his co-pilots, where he would make them tell him stories about what they would do in case of an emergency. He would say things like, if engine 2 goes out, what are the first words out of your mouth? Where are your eyes going to go? Tell me the first thing you're going to do with your hands. And if you listen to the cockpit recordings of Qantas Flight 32, after this hole appeared in the wing, and the hydraulic system started failing, and the electrical system started failing, and they had the worst mechanical disaster in modern aviation, what you'll hear is people speaking as if they're reading from a script. All the pilots are calm. They speak in short, clipped sentences. There's no sense of panic whatsoever. And in 99% of cases, that would have saved the plane. It would have saved the lives of everyone on board. Except that in this situation, there were so many problems with Qantas Flight 32 that there are not enough scripts on Earth to accommodate all the emergencies. As soon as the pilots would solve one problem, 10 more would pop up, and they would solve 3 of those, and 15 more appear. It was so overwhelming that no one could create a story in their head that encompassed everything that was going on. No one could keep track of all these emergencies that are breaking out at 20,000 feet in the air. And so Richard de Crespigny at this point does something really interesting. For the past 15 minutes, he's been trying to build a story in his head to keep track of everything that's going wrong. He's telling himself a story of where the fuel is going, where the electrical lines are good and where they don't work, what types of controls he can rely on, and this isn't working. In fact, he feels himself getting drawn into what's known as a cognitive tunnel. Now, all of you know what a cognitive tunnel is. It's when you're driving down the road and you're going the speed limit and you see a cop car out of the corner of your eye and you suddenly hit on the brakes even though you don't have to. Or when you're juggling the kids and making dinner and 5 other things, and suddenly you get a text from your boss and you type a hasty reply and hit send, and then immediately think to yourself I really wish I'd waited a couple of minutes to really think about what I wanted to say. A cognitive tunnel is when our brain, overwhelmed by the amount of stimuli around it, starts merely reacting to outside inputs, rather than allowing us to make choices and decisions. And de Crespigny, dealing with all these alarms around him, he feels himself getting drawn into this cognitive tunnel. So he does something really strange. In the middle of this emergency, he takes his hands off the controls, he closes his eyes, and he decides he's going to change the story in his head. In particular, what he decides is that he's going to start envisioning this plane, this Airbus A380, the most complicated plane ever invented, as a Cessna, which is the plane that he learned to fly on. Now, has anyone in this room ever flown on a Cessna? Okay, a number of you. So you know that if I was to put a Cessna and an Airbus A380 next to each other, it would not look like this. It would look like this, right? And a Cessna has almost nothing in common with an Airbus A380. It's like putting a toy next to a Maserati. And yet the thing about a Cessna is that it has these 3 things that any plane needs in order to fly. It has the ability to go up and down in the sky, it has a navigation system, and it has landing gear. So, by this point, they've managed to turn the flight around, and they're headed back to the Singapore airport. And as they're approaching the Singapore airport, one of the co-pilots says, according to the computers, we need 2,100 meters in order to stop this plane, if in fact our brakes work, if in fact the landing gear will hold up. And the longest runway that we have is 2,000 meters. And as they get closer and closer to the ground, an alarm goes off that's known as a squealer. Hopefully none of you have ever heard a squealer. It's an alarm that's been designed to be so loud and annoying that you can't ignore it. It can actually revive pilots from near unconsciousness. The squealer goes off in the cockpit as they're approaching the runway because the plane is so damaged, and de Crespigny turns to his colleagues and he says, ignore the squealer. Because the plane that's inside his head, the Cessna, there's no alarm going off. They get closer and closer to the tarmac. They eventually set down. The wheels absorb the impact. De Crespigny, in his head, is flying a Cessna, and the way that he would brake a Cessna at this point is that he would press down on the brake pedal and just hold it down as hard as he could. And so that's what he decides to do with this plane. A huge plane, he presses down the brake pedal and kind of goes like this. The plane is speeding down the runway. Around the runway, they can actually see these sand dunes that surround the Singapore airport. If they hit the sand dunes at too high a speed, the plane will literally flip over and kill everyone on board. But in his head, he's flying a Cessna, and the Cessna's doing okay. The metal starts groaning with the effort of trying to lose the speed. As they begin slowing, the brakes, it turns out, work. They're getting closer and closer to the end of the runway. They can actually see the sand dunes at the end of the runway, and with 100 meters to spare, the plane finally stops. 48 minutes later, all 469 passengers on board walk off the plane without one injury. Now, they've tried to recreate this landing hundreds of times in simulators. They've never managed to land the plane without killing everyone on board. And if you ask Richard de Crespigny why he was able to do this, he'll tell you that he doesn't really know, right? Maybe thinking of the plane as a Cessna, maybe that was the right thing to do. Or maybe he just got really lucky. Maybe thinking about the plane as a Cessna could have been completely the wrong choice in a different situation. But what he'll say is that by taking control, by having some story in his head, It gave him a place to start making decisions. That the only real mistake he could have made is to start reacting to all of the alarms. And that by having this mental model, he put himself in a place where he could decide what to pay attention to. He could decide to ignore the squealer. Now, when researchers have looked at this, they've asked a different question. And this gets to creativity, which is why was Richard de Crespigny able, in the heat of this moment, to pivot from one kind of mental model to a different mental model so seamlessly? And the answer to this actually comes from talking to Richard himself. Because if you've ever spoken to Richard, and I've talked to him about half a dozen times now, one of the things that you will learn very, very quickly is that Richard de Crespigny is one of the most argumentative assholes on the face of this planet. He is a man who will literally pick a fight with you about anything. One of his friends told me he once got into a 2-week argument with Richard about the proper ingredients for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which you wouldn't think there's that many options. But Richard de Crespigny, and we all know people like this, is just the kind of guy who loves to argue. In fact, the morning of the accident, when he was in that shuttle asking his co-pilots to tell him stories about what they would do in case of an emergency, they would say something, and then he would argue with them about the story they had just told. He would say things like, why are you going to put your hands there? Why are you going to that seems like a really dumb place to put your eyes. Why are you going to say that? He is, in other words, a terrible human being to have a beer with, and exactly the kind of guy that you want flying your plane when there's an emergency. Because for Richard de Crespigny, his contemplative routine is that he argues, right? He has this habit of picking fights that trains him to be ready to pivot from one mental model to another on the drop of a dime. And this is what we know about contemplative routines, is that they aren't relaxing. They aren't these things that allow us to meditate or to read or have fun. Instead, they're things that feel like work. And this isn't to say that to become a creative genius, you have to be an asshole. But it is to say that if you want to be the type of person who, in the middle of a project, can change your frame of reference, can say, instead of seeing this as a block of stone, I can see it as a sculpture. You have to train yourself to engage in behaviors that push you to change your mind. And whether that means picking fights with your friends, whether it means, like I do, coming home and telling your spouse about your day and then trying to see it from a different perspective, or whether it means just writing different stories in your head on your way to work, that is the habit that will end up allowing you to see things that no one else does. Thank you so much.